Hello, and welcome to the ACT's Working Capital Conference, where we have a really interesting lineup of 3 main live sessions on working capital topics, as well as some pre-recorded items, which I'd encourage you to look at as they focus on your own personal and career development in a virtual world, where it's more important than ever to spend quality you time. There's not much that's more important in today's challenging environment than working capital. So special thanks goes to Prime Revenue, our sponsor for the 3rd session this afternoon on supply chain finance. Thanks also to our wonderful speakers, and especially to Brian Shanahan and Naresh Agarwal for moderating the first 2 sessions. A few things to note through the afternoon. The site will be available for 14 days after the event to rewatch content, all of which is being recorded. There's a discussion forum available on the platform, so please do get involved in conversation, as that's often where we learn new things and make new connections. During the sessions, I'd really encourage you to use the Q&A function that's available to get a good discussion going. This option appears on the right-hand side of the presentation screen. And please do visit the resources pages for more information and materials provided by the ACT and our session sponsor, Prime Revenue. But without further ado, I'd like to hand over to our chair for the afternoon, the one and only Naresh Agarwal.
Thank you, Caroline. And I'm sorry to say that I'm not that unique. And there's actually a politician. And I found this morning even someone teaching accounting concepts with the same name. Having said that, this Naresh is delighted to be chairing this event. I've been reviewing over the last couple of months of our cash management qualification material. We make frequent reference to the importance of working capital. As many of you will have found from 2020, working capital is often the cheapest source of financing for many businesses. And in addition, when banks and rating agencies look at your credit risk, the way you manage short-term assets and liabilities is often seen as a key signal of how you run your business. Now, one of the things I love about the topic is the insights it can provide about the company. When I got involved in working capital as a treasurer, I learned a huge amount about how our sales and procurement activities were organized at both the strategic and operational level. And I found that with some small changes, I could make a lot of improvement around our cash generation and also make our cash forecasting processes more accurate and more effective. Now, this afternoon, we've got a varied program, and I hope you'll find at least one thing that makes you stop and think about how working capital operates in your own organization and what changes you may be able to influence to improve its management. In session 1, we'll be hearing from 2 treasurers about how the pandemic has led to a review of existing working capital practices. They'll also share their views on the role of technology to support good practice. In session 2, I'll be joined by 2 experienced treasurers who provide their views from very different ends of the market on credit risk. They'll share some of the tools available to treasury and finance teams to assess, monitor, and manage this key component of working capital. And then in our final live session of the day, Caroline will run a session that focuses on a tool we're told to expect to see more of in 2021, supply chain finance. Joining Caroline will be an experienced treasurer and a supplier of supply chain financing solution, Prime Revenue. This session will ask if supply chain finance is a force for good for all. I will explore a number of issues, including which companies it can suit, and also how it can work alongside ESG commitments. Now, that's a bit of a taster for what we're going to hear this afternoon. And now what I'd like to do is introduce Brian Shanahan, who'll lead the first session. Now, as many of you will know, Brian has worked with the ACT for a number of years and continues to provide relevant and topical insights on a whole range of cash management areas. Brian, over to you.
Naresh, thank you very much. And also to Caroline, thank you for those opening words. Yeah. So now we're going to kick off the first session for the afternoon. The title of the session is Beyond Survival, Bringing Working Capital Management Together. What we've seen certainly in the last year that, the traditional approaches to working capital management have really been examined very closely in 2020 with all the various things that happened, some of them more public than others. In this session, I'm joined by Martijn Bach and Anh Duong, and I'll start off. Just gentlemen, if you want to introduce yourselves, I'll start off with you, Martijn. Oh, Martijn, you're on mute.
Yes, apologies. Good afternoon. I'm Martijn Bach. I'm with Vion Food Group in the Netherlands, Group Treasurer, and as such responsible for treasury, of course, insurance and credit management. And we've had quite an eventful year. We were a slaughterhouse company with 5 billion turnover in euro in slaughtering products and about 12,000 employees. And looking forward to tell you more what happened last year.
Anh.
Thanks, Brian. Hi, I'm Anh. I'm the Group Treasury Director at ERM. ERM is an ESG consulting company with approximately 100 business units, 5,000 people operating in 40 countries across 6 continents. ERM is a private equity-backed business. We have around 700 partners, and we're backed by AIMCO and OMERS. For those who don't know, AIMCO and OMERS are large Canadian retirement funds, with $100 billion of asset under management. Prior to ERM, I had roles as head of treasury at Imperial College, and I was also head of forward FX and interest rate management at BP.
Thanks, Anh. Okay, well, let's start off with the first question that I've got. We've seen a lot of challenges in 2020, but I mean, from either what you guys have seen yourselves or colleagues that you speak to, what have you seen about how people have addressed those challenges around working capital management and supply chain in 2020? And also, in terms of the way people plan to face those challenges, has it ended up as a kind of a disconnect between what people intended to do versus what actually turned out? Maybe Martijn to start.
Yeah, maybe not a direct answer to your question, but leading to this session, I was thinking what happened last year, and especially like I explained earlier, I'm in the slaughter business, and which is an essential sector, at least in the Netherlands and in Germany. So we kept producing at the start of the pandemic, and we use many migrant workers. Thousands of them actually, and we hire them via flex agencies. And as you know, as you might know, migrant workers, they tend to live close together in close communities, so they work and live together. So there was a higher rate of infection, and in the beginning of the pandemic, there was not much testing going on, so no one really knew what was happening, and then that led to an extreme situation where we had extreme negative press, intense conversations with governments, leading to 1 or 2 closures of factories. I had the fortunate timing to be in the middle of my refinancing process, so that got delayed. I think we had a temporary suspension of our license of export to China because the Chinese people are reading in the newspapers about Vion, and this was of course quite negative at the time. And overall we have 4 business units, 2 more on the industrial side, but 1 is food service and 1 is retail. So the food service business was extremely hard hit, especially during the first lockdown. And in Germany they even changed the flex workers law. So now we have to hire 3,500 extra people. So that's quite a process change. And we still have shortage of workers. So all of this, and then in a combination with, of course, more intense receivable management and cash flow forecasting, was quite challenging. And then in combination with the Brexit and African swine fever, maybe not. That was a special year.
Yeah, it sounds like a long list of challenges there, Martijn. Yeah, how is 2020 for you in the same respect?
We were more fortunate than than we had feared. A lot of our work had not been severely disrupted. I suppose a lot of our work is in the ESG space, and as you know, it's becoming increasingly business critical, and so not so much hampered by the lockdown. Even the first lockdown that happened around March, the latest lockdown has not had so much impact on the work that we do. We've also benefited from the fact that we're multinational. A lot of our business is Far East and the US. So as you know, the lockdown phasing between continents has not been synchronized. So they kind of happen at different times. And now with China and the Far East emerging a little bit, we're not seeing the huge impact that we had at the beginning of the year, last year. Now, for a service company like ERM, our supply chain is the people and the services we can bring together to support our clients. So it's important to understand, the financial strengths of the parties within this supply chain. So for us, it's very important to make sure that the customer has not just confidence in us to be able to deliver the work, but it's also the customer, we can deliver work because we're reliant upon subcontractors who may encounter financial difficulties. So we make sure that we do proper vetting. We implemented lots of credit analysis tools. We speak to the clients, but we also present to our customers, a strong set of financials. We've got to make sure that we are financially disciplined and our credit rating is sound, and we've got tools to also support the businesses that we work for. So things like bank guarantees, performance bonds, and sureties. We need to have those in place so then any sort of potential customer will look at our group, and we are below investment grade, which tends to be the case for a lot of private equity owned businesses. They won't be fearful because they'll know that we can deliver the work on time and on budget without any disruption. We also considered a number of different financial tools. We also looked at things that could strengthen our liquidity position. So we looked at things like supply chain financing, factoring. We also looked at our bank facilities. So, all the sort of things that a typical corporate would have probably done during the height of the pandemic. So now it looks like things are a little bit better globally, but lockdowns can come and go. So we need to prepare and preempt any future events.
No, thanks, Anne. And for both of you again, I mean, lots happened in 2020, but just in regards of payables and receivables, do you think now the way corporate behavior towards those parts of the balance sheet has changed versus where we were 12 months ago, the time?
Well, yes and no. I think it has, of course, always been part of the job and always been important, but it has definitely been intensified, yes. And what we have done, and technology, of course, has a big role in this. We've downloaded immediately all a full receivable portfolio, and added a few filters on there, and started analyzing this, and together with the sales organization. And from a management point of view, we installed weekly calls with all the business unit management to start extra attention on limit breaches, aging, and all these kind of non-payment issues. Yeah. But overall, I must say that especially I think due to the fact that credit insurance companies are reinsured by governments in at least in the Netherlands and Germany, and I believe in other countries in Europe. That definitely helps, but that is a temporary thing. So I'm curious about the future. Yeah, but so far so good.
And Anne, same question. I mean, this must be curious for you guys because I imagine you have customers in just about every business sector you can think of.
Yeah, we're absolutely focusing on our AP and AR during the pandemic. I suppose it's critical to focus on the parts of the business that impacts working capital and cash in the group. And as you mentioned, it's the cheapest form of financing available to the firm. Mm-hmm. So add to the mix, we also look at managing credit risk as well. We also look at areas such as procurement. So they're normally the starting place to look to improve your working capital position. I suppose what's different now and before the pandemic, I think three things come to mind for me. The most obvious is that you need to get your AP and AR team to work effectively. We were lucky because we'd already had guys with laptops. We were fairly flexible working type workforce. So for us to make that transition from working in the office to working from home was fairly easy. And the second thing is for us, what we've noticed is trends happen much faster. The pandemic has accelerated a lot of trends in the business. So as Martin mentioned, you need to have the analytics, the tools, the Power BIs and the OneStream to have a look at the data that you're seeing from your customers and your clients to see whether there's changes in payment terms or whether your competitors are taking away some of the business because they're offering more competitive forms of trade deals or contracts that give them longer payment terms. Therefore, these tools are especially important. And then what we've also noticed is a lot of these key clients. We deal a lot with key clients. We have over 1,000 key clients and high value, high growth clients. And because a lot of them tend to be fairly good credit institutions, they have access to a lot of receivable financing programs, supply chain financing programs. And so they're trying to, in a way, they're trying to support their supply chain. And so, that has sort of impact on the way we do business and the way we kind of embrace these schemes, because you can't just ignore them, because if you do, then your competitors will take advantage of them as well. So it's very important for just not looking at your own situation, but also to understand the situation of all your clients as well and how it impacts your business.
Okay, I mean, just to talk about how to say the non-finance part of the business, because lots of people talk about this whole idea of a business having a cash culture, which for me is do the operational parts of the business actually understand how their day-to-day actions actually impact on the working capital result. I mean, do you think that has changed in the last 12 months in any way, either positively or negatively? And if so, is this a temporary thing because everyone just got shocked to hell, or is it going to be a more permanent result out of that? Martijn?
Yeah, well, hopefully it might stick, but I don't think it's a natural match between finance people and salespeople. But what helps, I think, is of course senior management attention. At least in my experience, in our culture, or in our company culture, it's the top-down attention really helps, and of course making it part of business reviews, and maybe it could affect bonuses. These type of things help, I think. But yeah, like I said, I don't think it's a natural match.
The cash culture is definitely much more important now than it was. As Agarash mentioned, rating agencies, banks, they always look at your cash. They always look at your DSOs and DPOs. For us, is very, very important. And we kind of, I think bringing people on board was a lot easier because they know what the situation is and they appreciate the situation. So AP, AR, procurement, purchasing, credit, it wasn't that much of a challenge to roll out new policies, to roll out new strategies to improve cash management and cash collection across the group. I suppose the other areas that we looked at was also in training. We've a lot of training was focused on making sure that people understand that the contracts they got into and the way they manage their customers and the AP and AR department. We also looked at tools and reward systems, as Martin mentioned. It's very, very important to highlight that cash management is going to be part of your balanced scorecard. Is going to be part of your remuneration package, and to make that fundamentally a point within their reward system and make everyone aware of that is very, very important. And finally, I suppose that the last thing is to make sure that you continue to learn. I think receivable financing and cash management, it's not an arms race, but it's forever changing. So you need to, things you do wrong, you need to learn and try to improve, and things you do well, you need to kind of pick them out and reinforce them. So it's very, very important in cash culture. But fortunately for us, I think the buy-in was fairly easy. And I don't know whether it's luck or anything, but our DSOs and DPOs are better now than before the crisis.
Mm-hmm.
Similar to us. And I think what also helps, we spend quite a lot of time talking to our stakeholders, and it can be a credit insurer, it can be a bank or whoever, but being as transparent as you can be, that definitely helps, I think.
And Anne, you mentioned earlier, your owner is a private equity company who traditionally are pretty focused on the balance sheet anyway, especially working capital. I wonder, has that kind of focus that you tend to get from a PE owner, is that something that was a good preparation then for 2020, or is it a case of the pressure increased even more because of 2020?
No, I believe it was helpful to be private equity owned business. I mean, there was always, as you say, always a challenge to drive the working capital position down as much as possible, to run cash very leanly, and to put in new systems in place that could release liquidity for the firm. So yes, I think the transition during the pandemic was, you could almost say, is a little bit textbook for us, but you still had to do it and reinforce some of the the strategies that you would normally use, but just reinforce them, and to make sure that everybody is fully aware of it, especially when you're all working from home. So it's important to get the communication across in effectively, which is not always so easy when compared to you're in an office and you have regular town halls in the first few months.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, well, listen, both of you have mentioned technology in this whole story of 2020, and we all know there's a whole load of different tools to help treasurers, either from a BI perspective, forecasting, etc. But I'm just wondering, what are the things that in the last year you've actually found more useful, rather than things that might be classed in the toy box, as it were? Yeah, Martijn?
Yeah, well, our background a little bit. We are sort of from an IT ERP basis. We are part of a big spaghetti environment. So in the past, it was definitely a challenge to even have correct figures. So that was phase one, and that took us quite a while. Well, you helped us, so And then I was very happy that when this happened, that first phase was gone, and then we did not have to spend too much time to have the correct figures, but we could use these figures to analyze and move forward. And that was, I think, for us, a huge benefit and a big shift in the use of technology. As you know, we use Cashforce. I'm not sure if that is a well-known product in the UK, but nevertheless, we use it for credit risk management and working capital management. Which is based on ClickSense, and you can filter all your SAP data, your full receivable database, and that definitely helps in managing your exposure. Yes.
Yes, technology is very important, and we've lent on technology quite a lot during the pandemic. But for private equity owned business, you can imagine that we tend to be a little bit more frugal in the way that we invest in new technology. But we have used a lot of off-the-shelf technology. So things like Power BI and OneStream, we use quite a lot to kind of understand our cash flows a little bit better, and to pick out trends and anomalies that may require a little bit more research. We've also looked at platforms out there, supply chain financing platforms. So there's a lot of technology that's been created by the banks and the fintechs to help companies increase liquidity for the firm. So, engaging in those particular products has been really helpful. We also looked at some down the line technology, but not close to implementing anything like that. I don't think they're readily available anyway. So things like blockchains, and it's a bit of a buzzword, probably less so now, but it and in a way it can support supply chain financing and receivable financing. We looked at that, but that's more further down the road.
Okay. Well, we have some questions coming in from the audience. I just remind you, if you haven't got your question in, remember what Caroline told us. It's up on the right-hand side of the screen. So please click and ask anything that you want. But the very first one in, here's a time to get your crystal ball out, guys. Yeah, because the first question is, how might supply chain disruption impact Treasury operations in 2021? Martijn?
Cool.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, well, depends on a little bit of what happens, of course, but well, I see a big challenge if depending on what happens in the credit insurance field, at least within VEON customer portfolio basis. If credit insurers are not reinsured by the government anymore, and then banks will not supply any liquidity, that might lead to quite some defaults, and then who knows what happens. So that's my biggest fear at the moment, and of course we need blue collar workers for production. That's okay.
Yes, I suppose for us the disruption will be fairly similar to the disruption that we've seen in 2020, but I believe that the risk is not the risk, but I think it will be less so for a supply chain business like ourselves, which provides services. Then I think we're in the job of fulfilling our customer requests and helping them out. So the key risk is further lockdown. We can't get to the sites that we want to do the work, and maybe things like additional distancing regulations, or so that when we get there, we can't have meetings with our clients in the way that we would have done. We can't have a group of people working together. So that's the sort of disruption that we would anticipate that could happen. Fortunately for us, a lot of our work is actually desk-based, even though we do a lot of ESG consulting. So somewhere around 80% of our work is desk-based. But again, you never know with this pandemic. Nobody knows when it's going to end. Just when you think it was going to end, it kind of rears its ugly head again. So you just got to anticipate the worst and hope for the best sometimes. And
Absolutely. One of the things I'm reminded of, anyone who's seen the Peter Sellers movie about the Pink Panther stuff, that just before all the karate scenes and all this, he had this phrase of expect the unexpected. You have no idea what's coming next. And I was just, we've all seen in the papers just recently the thing about computer chips. So we now have car plants all over the world shutting down because now they realize they use the same computer chips as PS5s and laptops and so on, which of course are in huge demand. So some of the, we've talked about pandemic and all sorts of other things which have happened as a result of that. But actually, there's an awful lot of different things all the time, which can impact on this. And it's interesting because that's a nice segue into my next question, which is, has the pandemic and Brexit reduced the number of our suppliers? And does this increase the importance of more joined up relationships with suppliers that transcends just mere working capital considerations? Anne, maybe if you want to take that first.
So for us, a lot of our suppliers tend to be fairly established suppliers. We're mainly a B2B business, and most of our customers are big businesses. So we tend to have bigger suppliers involved as well to support us. So the Brexit and the pandemic hasn't had that much of an impact, but we're mindful of that. So we make sure that we understand the financial positions of our supplier, and it's very, very important. So we use Reuters to monitor probability of default, credit defaults. We use Dun & Bradstreet to look at their financials. That's very, very important. Yeah, I think it's that's what is important, to really understand the robustness of your supplier. Now, in terms of managing relationship, yeah, absolutely critical. You need to have a very, very good relationship with your supplier. If your customers are stretching payment terms, you may need to stretch payment terms to your suppliers. So, you've got to be able to talk to them and tell them that, these things are going to happen, and they got to understand it. But not all suppliers are the same. So you need to really understand that.
And Martijn, I know as a fresh food supplier, you do supply into the UK from continental Europe. I imagine this has had a much more direct impact for you guys.
Yeah, if you're not nice to me, you will not have bacon tomorrow. Huh? So no. But maybe not from a working capital perspective, but nevertheless, we of course need to work very close together with our farmers, and not our farmers, but the farmers. And we are building change, connecting the farmers and the slaughterhouses and the retailers together, also from a track and traceability point of view, animal welfare point of view, and we are indeed investigating if there's a possibility to also add a sort of a finance house, so to distribute the wealth, but also sort of level out the working capital needs in the chain. Because, as you know, retailers have a negative working capital. We pre-finance and the farmers pre-finance the chain. So that we're looking at that. But is that a solution for our near future problems? No, I don't think so. But we will definitely look at it. Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Well, our next question from the audience is about forecasting tools. Yeah. So how can forecasting tools or processes support any further disruption in the coming year?
Well, forecasting tools for me is absolutely essential to understanding and preparing for disruption. So if you're looking at working capital, you need to model the behavior of what happens to your cash position on a disruption event or continued disruption event, as we're seeing now. But you also need to understand what happens when the event unwinds and how that impacts working capital. As your gross revenue builds up, that's very important. And all the deferrals that you've had from government. Government has been very active in helping you delay tax payments in certain jurisdictions. So it's very, very important to see the impact on your working capital when those events unwind. So by being able to forecast, you can prepare, you can put in contingencies. So that's particularly important. And for us, for 100 BUs with lots of different countries, regions, you don't have time to get everyone to do a bottom-up forecast. So you may need to have a model in place where you can run from top down. So that's very important. And to get that model working, you may need to stress test it. You may need to do back testing to make sure it's effective. And so forecasting is absolutely critical to making sure that you have adequate liquidity to run the business at all times.
Martijn?
Yeah, I agree with Tom. Essential, especially in these times. We have a dual approach, I must admit. So we have the bottom-up approach from the business units, and then in combination with a tool we use, which has a algorithm on it and predicts the payment on our total receivable basis. So we have we have quite a good view on what happens at a short time, and then we have the deviations on our budget we use to have a shorter, longer term view.
Yeah, and certainly one of the things I've seen in 2020 is the big problem has been short-term forecasting. The 3-4 weeks period. And if you have one particular business sector that just fell off a cliff, then basically your historic analysis is just about useless. But also, what I've seen is many people have played many scenarios, particularly in the earlier part of the year. Thankfully, most of those have not turned out nearly as bad as were expected. Now, obviously, that depends on the particular industry you're in, but it does show that there's not just the importance of being able to forecast, but then also to measure the accuracy of that forecast after the actual situation has happened. And I think that goes right back to the tools point that without that ability to react very quickly in these situations, it could be much more difficult without those tools in place.
Yeah, and I think the discussion you have when discussing these deviations is also extremely important, because then it helps people to understand their own business from a cash point of view.
Absolutely, and it's always the problem in the variance discussion, isn't it?
Yep.
When someone says, "Well, why did that variance happen?" My experience is at least 50% of the time the person being asked the question doesn't know. Yeah. And at least when the data is there, it helps people to educate themselves as to actually what's really going on.
Yeah. People tend to have as a basis that there's sufficient cash, so that's not their problem. But now there has of course been a shift from cash is king, and like we discussed earlier, and then you have a totally different discussion and different understanding of how the business is really operating. And it's interesting. From a cash point of view, that's also an interesting discussion, I think.
Yeah. However, some industries would say that interesting can be dangerous too. Yeah. Anyway, moving on. Next question we have in the audience. We hear talk of a K-shaped recovery in 2021. Does this require a reevaluation of credit risk methodology? Martijn, you've mentioned credit risk.
Yeah, but that was not with the intention to answer this question. But K-shape, what do they mean? What is
I think this is an American term where there's certain parts of the economy recovering very well and certain parts of the economy not recovering. Yeah.
I agree.
I mean, is this an impact on the business you're doing with your clients?
Well, yeah, I think it's very important to have forward-looking credit risk methodology. So for us, in the past, we may have used certain metrics, the traditional accounting metrics or financial report metrics. Now we employ more forward-looking metrics to analyze credit risk. So we look at things like CDSs. We look at proprietary sort of risk metrics produced by Reuters on probability of default, and they use all sorts of very, very quantitative scientific stuff that I've not really read in detail, but it captures things like the number of times bankruptcy has been mentioned in the press about a certain company, and they found out it's very, very effective at monitoring credit risk. So I have no doubt that we'll probably get some form of K-shaped recovery, because we had a K-shape on the way into the pandemic and during the pandemic. So it's highly likely we'll have a K-shape on the way out, especially now that you've probably got quite a lot of zombie companies that have been supported by government funding and bank funding, etc. So you need to have forward-looking sort of tools in place.
I know certainly one of the things that lots of the people I speak to, yes, they're worried about defaults, but also they're worried about late payment. And one of their experiences is that when you're dealing with the various credit rating agencies and so on, that there's a time lag between the information that they give you, and they're very much focused on the risk of default, rather than the risk of late or early payment. And one of the things I see is sometimes you see people who are regarded as high risk by one of these agencies who are actually paying you early, or on very short terms. And of course, you find the opposite as well. Someone is deemed low risk, but actually is a terrible payer, and probably has been historically. So it's really a case sometimes of which eventuality you're trying to mitigate against, default or late payment. Totally different things in my book. Yeah. Well, swiftly moving on. Actually, this plays to something you just mentioned, Don. Yeah. How have government support programs made it harder to get a true assessment of the financial strength of your customers?
Yes, it definitely makes it a lot harder. And I suppose you have to look at things like CDSs, which would normally capture a lot of the market available information, and somebody else is doing the work for you, which is the traders. If you believe in efficient market theory, although if you're trading in GameStop shares, you probably wouldn't believe it so much. Yeah, it's very important to understand the deferments, and it is very difficult to find that information with your clients sometimes. So you need another way of looking at it. If you know, especially if you've got thousands and thousands of clients, or customers or suppliers, you may find it a bit of a struggle to do, have a big dedicated team to analyze that credit risk exposure. So you may need to rely on a third-party provider to be able to do that for you. It's a bit of a cheap way out, but it's effective for small firms that don't have investment in a big credit team.
I know from a supply chain perspective, lots of people I speak to, and they're not so much worried about their larger suppliers, people who have access to market capital and so on, but they're worried about their smaller suppliers that in many cases they've taken all these tax deferments, loans, grants, some of which may have to be paid back at some point. And they're worried that some of these guys are building up debt, which at a later point they won't be able to repay. So in effect, things might not seem so bad now, but they're worried about 6 months, 12 months down the line. Do I have big gaps in my supply chain because these folks have just disappeared? Martijn, I mean, I know you guys have lots of small suppliers as farmers, but you also have lots of smaller customers too.
Yeah, but we have that team on mentioned, so I don't need to rely on external information. We have 10 to 12 people really following our receivable portfolio fully on line-by-line basis, and then following payment behavior, limit breaches, etc. So that is extremely helpful to have that. So therefore, I don't see the immediate impact of governmental support. It will not immediately impact our risk exposure, I think. Smaller suppliers, I expect that there will be a shift to bigger suppliers, definitely, yes. Yeah.
Okay, because I think that's the other thing from a supply chain perspective that we've probably all learned, that lots of us, and it very much depends on the industry and country you're in and all this kind of stuff, have actually no idea where half the stuff really comes from if we were to look at it, the whole thing completely end to end. So like I was mentioning with the computer chip.
In the food industry, that's no longer accepted. So we are a bit further in that process.
Yeah. And
we are at the point that you can scan the piece of meat and then you know what where the pig or the cow has been and what for kind of recipe he has had. So that's a different sector, I guess. Yeah.
But it's interesting in the meat industry, that's kind of been, that's come in the last 10, 15 years through regulation, but many other industries have nothing like that.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. And it did help in the pandemic, so that the Q&A was and has been for years a big thing for us. So that did definitely helped the last year.
Yeah, well, what I also find interesting in this is that if you remember, it must be almost 10 years ago since the tsunami in Japan. And one of the results of that, again, in the car industry, was there was lots of car parts being made in that specific province in Japan, then couldn't be supplied to plants in the US. So there was, again, big supply chain breaks, but no one expected. But the strange thing for me is, that happened nearly 10 years ago. And we still see these things happen, like the computer chips, like the tsunami, Superstorm Sandy. I mean, there's been lots of these different things. And I'm not sure, collectively, we've learned that many lessons. Yeah.
Yeah, we have a similar, as you know, we have a similar situation in China with African swine fever. I think it killed over 100 million pigs the last few years. So there's a huge demand of meat there. So that's also has an incredible influence on the supply chain for us. Yeah.
Okay. Here's a good one. Different question from the audience. What sort of cash metrics do you have in your annual budgets? Han?
So the cash metrics we have, talking about KPIs. So we have DSOs and in particular, because the main driver of cash for us is how fast our clients pay us. So DSO is day sales outstanding. So that's a key metric for us. Obviously, that's what we look at. It's also a measure of how effective we are at collecting money from the business, as well as how our clients' payment intentions change over time. It's actually incorporated into our balance scorecard. So people are remunerated on that statistic as well. So it's a very, very important statistic.
Martijn?
Yeah, mainly cash conversion cycle, I think I know. Per business unit, because it differs a bit. Food service with clients who pay have a longer payment terms, but that's the main thing we use. And of course, limit breaches, because then in our business, if you breach the limit, then it's not insured. So and we have our full receivable portfolio insured. So that's always a big one.
Sorry, here's an interesting one, but it might be a little bit topical. I'm not sure how it impacts your respective companies, but here goes, guys. Yeah, the question is, what will Brexit and Biden mean for working capital? I couldn't think of a broader question. Yeah.
Well, we don't manufacture goods, so that needs to cross borders so much, and we have local offices in Europe that do the work that we require. So generally, we don't think Brexit will affect working capital for us so much. Obviously, it will have an indirect impact in the way it impacts the economies of the UK and Europe to a certain extent, and therefore any performance will have an impact on working capital build-up there. In terms of Biden, then I suppose for us, again, an indirect impact through Biden's policies towards greenhouse, climate change, and carbon transition. So it may boost our business, which will also have an impact on working capital. The other more direct impact would be tax policies, but it's too early to make a judgment on what's going to happen. There's talks that Biden will be less keen on keeping tax rates low, therefore, or more likely or less likely to let people defer tax payments, so there may be an impact there, but it's just a little bit too early to make judgment on that.
Martijn, do you have any opinion on that?
Assuming the relation with China will improve with Biden, that might change our world a little bit, because China tended to import more meat from Europe because of the relation with Trump, because of the trade restrictions following that relation. And then it has a negative impact on our working capital, because if we export more to China, then because the ships takes 6 to 7 weeks, it has a negative impact, because our DSO is now 24 days, and then 42 plus.
Yeah, it's an interesting point about global trade, isn't it? That it's great that because we trade internationally, we can do more business. Brilliant. Yeah, more profit.
Yeah, but you need to pre-finance it. Yeah.
But exactly, and if you're delivering to Jumbo supermarket in the Netherlands, it's there in 2 or 3 days.
Exactly.
And to Shanghai is what, 40 odd days? Yeah.
Although Jumbo tries to pay in 90 days, but
sure, but
but
it's the length of the supply chain just gets much, much longer, and this is something that many people in many industries have experienced in the last 25 years. That I remember many years ago I was working in a greetings card business, and we found that importing from China meant we had to ship whole container loads, so bigger batch sizes, and secondly there was the shipping time, which we had to pay for. Which meant that our balance sheet pretty much exploded. Yeah, even though it was a very profitable venture, but like everything, it has consequences. Shifting slightly, guys, because one of the questions I've got here is about remote working. So remote working, some of which we're still forced to do, some of which is still a bit optional depending on what part of the world you're in. Has it improved treasury operations or made it more difficult? Ron?
I'd probably say on balance it makes it a little bit more difficult, but then there's a human side to that as well. I think it generally makes the staff a little bit more happy working from home for the team that I have. So I suppose prior to the pandemic, probably would not have been an advocate of Treasury working from home. Maybe working from home for a couple of days a week or day a week. But because of the obvious areas that would present difficulties would be, payment security, documentation, signing, relationship management. These are all things that prior to pandemic you would have thought, how's this going to work? But since the pandemic, I think my views have changed. I actually quite like working from home. I find myself more productive working from home. The problems that had presented themselves in the past, I suppose you just need to work on them. I think that's what the world's had to do, implement additional segregation of duties, making sure your security is fairly robust. For documentation and signing, you want to use digital signatures, so that's an area of technology that would work well. You need to work closely with the banks and the lawyers, because a lot of times you need to sign documents and have witnesses, so you got to make sure that works well, especially with witnesses in a lockdown situation. Now for relationship management, we get on just as well with the banks. If anything, it's easier to get a meeting with a bank now. We're not struggling to find a meeting room, but the only thing you skip out is a couple of nice lunches every now and then. But I think it's I think it works well for Treasury, and it's also, I think that the point is that I think it keeps my team fairly happy. I think they all love it. The young team, and not having to spend an hour on a train into London makes a huge difference.
Martijn, what's your experience been?
No, I agree with the most part of An's analysis, but my team doesn't like it that much. Also, I guess because we don't need to travel that long, and I like to meet the people as well. But what definitely helped is that we have everything in the cloud. As all our Treasury tools, from a Treasury management system to FXall, what have you, everything is in the cloud. So that definitely helps. So it's definitely possible. Is it preferable? Well, in my experience, walking around the office helps also from a risk management point of view, because you start talking to people, and then they tell you about problems or issues they have, and now you only talk to people when you have a Teams meeting, and then you go to the topic instead of the coffee talk. And my experience that helps also from a risk management point of view, just to understand not only what's going well, but also to understand what's not going well. And
yeah, it's interesting.
I miss that.
I was talking to someone a couple of weeks ago who just went through a major refinance process, in his case with 40 plus banks. Yeah. And he was absolutely amazed that he was able to get through the whole process remotely, when he would have expected to have been literally flying all over the world in a traditional process, and soaking up lots of times in the airports and hotels and all that, which of course none of that was necessary. Yeah. And he found the whole process, much more efficient. But interestingly, on the other side of it, there is I think there's a 50-50 split, isn't there, between those people who love it and those people who hate it. And for the people who hate it, it's cabin fever. They just, there's an element of, you just need to get out and meet people and interact and all that. And one other thing I've been told by certain people is that for lots of kind of, just if we look at just from a pure functional point of view, we have all the tools in the cloud and this and that and so on. That's fine. But especially when there's times to bring your team together where, you need to brainstorm on some ideas or something like that then becomes much more difficult over this kind of medium, rather than having, 4 or 5 people in a room, who can interact directly with each other. But it's a range of opinions. But the final bit on this for me is that lots of companies I'm coming across, they like the idea that they don't need all the office space anymore. Yeah. So for those people who don't like working from home, I'm guessing that a lot of them are going to have to get used to it long term, because they're going to be hot desking in some respect, in a way that keeps the P&L happy, if not anybody else. Yeah.
Well, as you know, I refinanced during the pandemic, and I was not able to include digital signing. they did not want to discuss that with banks.
Well, that's a big subject, even for just Treasury, but international trade. Still most of the documentation is still kind of wet signature. I mean, that has to change at some point. And I know certain people in trade finance have been talking about this for years, and it hasn't happened. But listen, lots of different cogs in the wheel have to go around that. But following on from that, I mean, one of the things that I have seen a bit of, but I'll ask you guys a question, is say, when banks are asked at the moment to say, do you think there's going to be some kind of liquidity squeeze? And it seems like their universal answer is, nah, don't worry about that. This is not going to be a problem at all. But actually, what I'm hearing on the quiet is that some of them are actually worried about this. And I wonder, what have you guys seen or not seen, as the case may be, which might suggest that that statement of mine might be true or not.
Yeah, I don't recognize it. Maybe on.
We've not seen anything, but I suppose you could argue that a lot of banks were in the process of cleaning up their balance sheet even before the pandemic hit. So, HSBC, you read about the restructuring that's happened over the last couple of years, plans. So, but we're not hearing from it. And right now, governments and central banks have stepped in and provided huge amounts of liquidity as well as counter-cyclical actions. They both banks' liquidity ratios, the LCR, liquidity coverage ratios, have held up really, really well. And if anything, they've probably risen. So these support measures may not be there forever. So there's loads of liquidity now, but there may not be a lot of liquidity in a year or 2 years down the line. You've got to bear in mind that the European debt crisis didn't happen during the height of the financial crisis. It happened a couple of years later. So with that in mind, I think you do need tools in place just to protect you. You don't need to bring that liquidity straight away, but you do need tools. So things like RCF, making sure you have a receivable financing solution in place, that's something that you can work on just to prepare for the unexpected that could happen in 2 years' time.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, Anne, because I was talking to one UK banker who has been heavily involved in all these COVID loans, which are, I think 80% guaranteed by the government. And what they're worried about is that when everything kind of returns to normal and lots of these businesses would naturally fail at that point, that either the UK government might not have the money to pay them back, or because they're short on funds might stretch it out, therefore increasing the pain of the bank. And therefore they are trying to take limited measures at this point to see, what risks can they kind of back away from, which help them, a year or two down the line when this could be a problem. But again, hopefully none of this happens.
Yeah.
Okay. Next question I've got from the audience. The most direct way of improving working capital is via AP and AR management. What's your opinion on managing the other key point in the cash conversion cycle, particularly around inventory? I imagine this is more relevant to you, Martijn.
Yeah, but a difficult one. We also started with the low-hanging fruit to focus on the payables and the receivables. And we have a different supply chain because pigs and cows at some point need to be slaughtered. So it's not like you can always have the timing and match the supply with the demand as you wish. From a mechanical point of view. So we have some models in place to be as lean as possible, but that's it. Therefore, we try to build these chains in the supply chain to have a more forecasted supply chain and from a demand point of view.
Well, I suppose you guys are unusual in that you have a pure biological supply chain. So it's really all the way from the start of the process is way back on the farm, months before it ever arrives at your premises.
We try to convert this full chain to a demand-driven chain and look at the market first, and then set up a chain where the based on a certain recipe, the pork is prepared, etc. But it's a process.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I certainly see on the inventory subject when we hit times of recession, is what you tend to see is that people sell off the fast-moving stock first, and what you see then is the inventory numbers go down, which matches exactly what macroeconomists would expect. But the problem is that all the stuff that doesn't sell well, is sitting on the books the whole time. And then all that happens is when demand returns, suddenly the stock of the fast moving items goes back to the level it was, sometimes even higher. And you're still stuck with the bad stuff. And particularly, if you talk to insolvency practitioners, they'll tell you this, that when they move into a company that they're winding up, they end up with stock that they just can't ship because nobody wants it. There's no demand for it. And of course, these are problems that they build up over time. And how do you say the peak only gets above the water, when times are bad. And but after saying all that, I think we'd all agree that usually the priority of working capital actions is first about your customers and seeing what you can collect or changing payment terms and things like that. Second, around AP, and the last one is usually inventory, because it tends to be much harder to change, and it's a much longer term thing than the other two.
And it influences the business, where the other two are more financial.
Yeah, definitely. And I know certainly in the last financial crisis, I was working with a chemical company, and you're trying to convince an engineer that the vat size, it could be 70%. Or the batch size, pardon me, could be 70% of what it is, because that's when you can still have an efficient reaction in the chemical process, which of course, if you're in manufacturing, that's terrible, because you want to have the lowest unit cost possible and just fill the thing up and make it. Very difficult conversations and very counterculture. But I think that's why many companies do focus on the other two first before inventory. Here's an interesting one. Is having enough cash to burn until the pandemic over the right strategy for those with liquidity problems? Now, I imagine this refers to, restaurants and the airlines and so on. But could they be doing something else, maybe? Martijn?
Yeah, well, of course, they should do a lot of things, but cash is extremely important. But these are the things we've been discussing the last hour. You need to look at your suppliers and customers and see where you can get this working capital reduced, and look at the other stakeholders, like lenders and stuff. But not sure that answers your question, to be honest.
Well, it does. What's your view?
Well, yeah, I mean, obviously, totally agree with Martin. Cash is king. But I think one thing that we haven't mentioned so far in this call is about remittance, because you've got the cash, but you're not bringing it to the right place. It's useless. So you've got to make sure you have an effective remittance strategy as well, and also you've got to make sure that you don't lose money as well. So it's very important to have very effective credit analysis of your clients and your. Those two things are not necessarily cash related, but they do have an impact on your ability to generate liquidity for the business in the future. So remittance is definitely an area that a lot of people tend to forget. And as you know, with the way government surpluses, or not lack of surplus, getting worse and worse, and with all these support measures, then there's going to be some rises in taxation there, withholding tax. You've got to consider all those facets that you might want to put that money to the place where it's needed now, rather than try to take it out later when the taxes are that little bit higher.
Yeah, and I would add to that I think emergencies like this catch out what I call the window dressers. So thankfully there's not too many of them. There's less of them certainly than there was at the start of my career. But I'm talking about the people who deliberately delay payments at half year and quarter end and so on, simply just to dress up the balance sheet. But they haven't resolved any underlying issue, process, whatever, and they oftentimes can be much more impacted by these disruptions, simply because their underlying processes just are nowhere near prepared, and they've just been taking knee-jerk reactive actions that kind of make them look good in the market, but actually, when you lift the hood, the engine's not quite right at all. Yeah.
Yeah, but nevertheless, it still influences the rating. Yeah.
Well, yes. Which actually shows more of the deficiencies we have around financial reporting, ratings.
Yeah, I fully agree. Yeah.
It all relies on that core subject.
The desktop picture you have of a balance sheet and a P&L, and then.
Yeah, and it's interesting when you talk about, say, cash flow statements, because I can remember when they came in first. What's that, about 1990 or thereabouts? Someone will correct me on that, I'm sure. Yeah, and I still don't know, quite frankly, what does a cash flow statement really tell me? Yeah. Because different countries have different methods and so on, and I understand the purpose of it, but I'm not sure it's actually fit for purpose. Yeah, in the same respect around accounting reporting. Yeah, particularly around not around profitability. We have lots of that stuff. Yeah, but around liquidity and talk about going concerns concept and stuff like that. You'd expect these things to support that. But anyway, that's a personal hobby horse which has been going for more than 30 years for me. Yeah, and still doesn't have a resolution. Okay, here's one. Has the crisis accelerated working capital best practices, and have treasurers become more proactive than simply reactive? Martijn? This might not necessarily be each of you. This might be, other treasury colleagues that you talk to in other companies as well.
Yeah, definitely. Yes, I think there's a more leading role for the treasurer in this, following the cash is king definition, of course. I fully agree.
Yeah, absolutely agree. Very, very important.
Because I'm certainly, from some of the people I speak to, this is put in some cases, not all, additional pressure on Treasury from the perspective of, and I think, Martijn, you mentioned it earlier, that many people in the business think cash just falls out of the sky and somehow everything's going to be okay. But actually, there's a lot of work to make sure that really does happen, and with recognition comes focus, and with focus comes potentially pressure. That when the cash balance is not right for some reason, it's very easy to shoot the messenger rather than address the underlying issues.
No, I recognize that statement. I've had these discussions in our company. Yes. So yes.
Okay. Well, the final question I have. We know that cash forecasting has become more granular, and that payment and receipt trends have changed dramatically in 2020. Does this mean that treasurers are having to pay more attention to sales and procurement activity? And what does that look like? Are they influencing AP and AR terms, or just monitoring activity? Bit of a long question, that one. An, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's very important, but we do look at sales. We do look at the pipeline. We also look at procurement strategy, because that's where it kind of almost starts. But so yeah, those are the once you've signed that contract, you may not have that much flexibility to improve your AR if you already got a very good AR department. So you need to consider what's in your procurement contract. One of the things that we looked at was to kind of rehash and improve the procurement contract to make sure it's fair and consistent across the whole group. You don't want to be too tough on the customers, but you need to understand it. But it's also, you need to read other people's procurement contract if you're a supplier, right? So it's a bit of both. So you need to draft your own, and you need to read your suppliers or your customers. So it's very, very important.
And Martijn, a 30-second answer?
Yeah. The big change is, of course, that we're part of the discussion now, and that we have standard payment terms, and if there's a deviation, then Treasury is involved, for approval.
Okay. Well, listen, thanks, Anne. Thanks, Martijn. We've run out of time. But just to remind the audience, you can watch the session again on demand. As Caroline said earlier, there's the discussion forums that continue online. Please do complete the session feedbacks. which really do help us in the longer term to improve the quality of the sessions and what we talk about. Yeah, that's it. And thank you very much for your time today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Brian.